All right, so this is hopefully my audio sounds okay. I'm trying the picture-in-picture thing to make it a little more interesting. The audio might be slightly worse than normal, but we'll see. Anyway, so this is my 23-month update learning French and 1 year learning with the mass immersion approach. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I've done differently since I first started learning French, how much I've done, what's my level, and all that good stuff. So, first of all, why don't we jump into it? A big part of learning French right now has been watching TV, reading books, and doing Anki. Those three things are the three horsemen of my study strategy. If you want more information about the specifics of this strategy and why I'm doing it, I'll link a Reddit post that I did a few months ago that I talked a little bit about my rationale, my thinking, and I still agree with it. So you can read that if you like. And if you want more specific information about the mass immersion approach, I'll leave a link to Matt versus Japan's channel. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about what I've done. So basically, my study routine is I study 10 new cards in Anki every day from sentences that I've sentence mined from novels. And then I read somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes a day. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I also watch about 2 hours of TV a day or movies. My average over, I'll talk about the average in a second, but my average has definitely increased over time. But so why don't we start with what I've watched and read first, and then I'll get into my Anki cards and what that's all about. So right here was I have a spreadsheet where I keep track of everything that I watch. I find it very motivating to see my numbers go up. But the problem is sometimes you watch so much that it takes forever to scroll down, and it takes forever. My computer's not the newest, so scrolling down to the very bottom of the list every time takes a while, and for the whole thing to load. But this is the first spreadsheet that I made, and I kind of just tracked everything as I went. Initially, I didn't track things, so I had to go back and figure out the things that I actually watched. It was pretty easy because it's all on Netflix and they keep track of what you've watched. So you can just find the spreadsheet and type it in. I watched 50 hours apparently of Star Trek. That might be a slight exaggeration because I just used the 45-minute standard time, but I didn't subtract things like credits or opening sequences and stuff, which is what I typically do because I want a more accurate count. But yeah, I watched 50 hours of the French dub of Star Trek. If you want to get into listening to TV without subtitles, Star Trek is actually an excellent way to get started, especially if you have nostalgia for it from when you were young, because they talk very simply, honestly, very politely. They don't slur their words at all. In fact, it's a little artificial. But in fact, that's actually pretty close to what it's like in English, actually. If you actually listen to it, the way they talk, it's very stilted. It's very kind of awkward, actually. But I think that's kind of the appeal. So I really like Deep Space Nine, so I watched a lot of episodes of that. I kind of got tired of it eventually, but that was one of the first things I watched, and then I kind of just went from there. I'm probably not going to talk about the specific shows that I've watched just because there's so many. There's a lot of stuff on Netflix that you can check out. Probably the best ones. There's a show called 10%, which is or Call My Agent in English. Everyone always talks about that show. It's a really good one. I really liked a show called what I'll do is I'll talk about some things I've been watching recently, and that's probably more interesting. But anyway, this is my first spreadsheet. This is just for the first 500 hours. I'm not sure when I hit that, but that was from the first 500 hours. And this is my current spreadsheet. So right now, as of today, I'm at 560 hours, which is cool. So I just had a carryover here for my first 500 hours. And so this is just where I track it. So in terms of things that I've watched recently, I've been watching the show Seven Deadly Sins, the anime on Netflix. It's kind of fun. It's like the story is kind of basic and not super complex, but it's easy to watch, and the difficulty of it is not too bad either. I do miss words once in a while, definitely. Right, like it's not that I don't know the words; it's like I can't hear them. It's relatively easy, and I'm also watching the show Haikyuu, I think it's pronounced. It's a volleyball anime, which is kind of fun. Anime in general, it's just kind of fun to watch because it feels less stressful to watch sometimes because it's really easy to follow the plot and they talk very clearly, very articulately. And so even when it's sometimes they shorten words the way people typically do when they talk systematically, but it tends to be again the plots are very simple and like comforting and the language is relatively simple. So it's relatively easy and it's a fun way to like end the night. Like if I watch say 2 hours or an hour and a half of like a drama in French, and that that can be very strenuous because it's hard to understand what they're saying. They mumble a lot. sometimes it's nice to fill in the gaps, watch 2 or 3 episodes of anime or other shows that are animated tend to be easier. Or like YouTube also serves that function where I can, because again, it's all about hours, right? I estimate that it's going to take me 1,500 hours to get to a really good level in French. So I'm only at 37% of that goal right now. This number, it's kind of anecdotal, but Dreaming in Spanish, he talks about this, that roughly it takes 1,500 hours to get to a really good level to just be able to hear all the words. You may not know every single word you hear, but you can hear it in the same way, similar that you can in English. And so, really, 560 hours is not that much, and I'm only a third of the way there. So even though sometimes it's really frustrating that you can't understand everything yet, I can notice my progress, definitely. And it honestly doesn't seem to matter what I'm watching, honestly. As long as there's a visual component, if I'm watching and I can see what's happening, I feel like every 100 hours I make the same amount of progress, like regardless of what I'm watching. If I'm watching a lot of dubbed TV, for example, that tends to be quite a bit easier than non-dub stuff, I would say 100 hours feels exactly the same in terms compared to non-dub content or anime or animation. And when I go back to, so when I, if I watch a lot of difficult stuff, like say a drama in French, when I go back to the easy stuff feels much easier. So I'm definitely improving no matter what I watch. Now, I would say like the easy stuff tends to be a little bit easier for your soul a little bit. Just sometimes it can be crushing to watch an hour long TV show and barely understand what's going on. But I don't think it really makes a difference in terms of how much you're learning, as long as you can do it. That's the nice thing about easy stuff. You can kind of just do it a lot longer without it being mentally straining. I feel like I have to balance. Like I try to do like the more difficult things I want to watch first, and then fill in the gaps with easier YouTube videos or anime or animation stuff like that. That's kind of my strategy. That just it's really just about the hours. I have to hit 1,500 hours, and when I hit that, my listening comprehension will be good. At least that's the plan. And I see no reason why that's not the case because I am clearly improving. In terms of where I'm at, in terms of what I can understand, again, it really depends. Like if I'm watching a live action TV show that I've seen like 10, 20, 30 episodes of, there'll often be cases I'll go several minutes and understand every single thing they say word for word. If it's like a brand new show, the first couple episodes are often kind of rough because I'm still getting used to their accent. But again, it depends on like the characters too. If there's a character who speaks very like properly and formally, I can understand them really easily. Whereas if it's like a cool kid, like a cool teenager who mumbles a lot and slurs their words, it can take me seasons of a TV show to finally understand what they're even saying. And so yeah, it really depends. And now the I tested myself with Peppa Pig just to be curious, like if I watched an episode, would I understand that 100%? And nope, I can't watch Peppa Pig 100%. If I watch like 10 or 20 hours of it, I bet I would hit 100%. Just because it's not that I don't understand the words. I understand either all the words or if a word comes up that I don't know, they'll explain it in the show. And so the grammar and vocab is obviously fine with Peppa Pig, which is great because it's a kid's show. Once in a while, like every couple minutes, I might miss a word because I don't quite hear what they said. Just because, again, I'm not quite used to the accent that or not the accent exactly, but the precise way they pronounced it. My ear was just not quite tuned to that. But yeah, so I would say I can watch Peppa Pig word for word without referring to like without watching subtitles or anything like that. But every couple minutes, I might miss a word because I mishear it. And I would say actually Star Trek and Peppa Pig are similar levels of difficulty. So if you're like not into Peppa Pig, which I definitely am not, it's pretty boring after 10 minutes. Star Trek is a great place because I would say it's about equivalent. That Star Trek and Peppa Pig are both kind of unnatural, simple speech. But it's a great way to get started to kind of get your. It's good for your sanity too. Like it's nice to watch something that's relatively easy. So definitely check that out. Quickly before I move on, some other shows that I've watched recently. There's a great family TV show. It's kind of like Modern Family, but in France, called Fais pas ci, fais pas ça, which means basically don't do this, don't do that. And actually, I think Modern Family is based on it or like inspired by it. And it basically follows two families. One that's more like conservative and traditional family. There's like 4 kids, a stay-at-home mom, a dad who works in an office, and like what their life is like. And then there's also another family. They would be called the bobos in French, which means like kind of more modern. They're left leaning. They're like have like more modern jobs. They're like a mixed family. And the writing kind of goes up and down actually throughout the seasons. I'm on season 8, I guess, right now. There's some really good episodes, and it's a lot of fun. And it's really nice to actually see French people like kind of in normal environments. And it's sometimes hard to tell like is the situation that they're in like it's like I'll be like why did they do that or why do they act that way? Is that just a way people act in France, or am I just kind of or is this meant to be like comedy, or is it just bad writing? Sometimes I'm not sure. Like sometimes I'll see them like sitting around the table and peeling vegetables like as a family, which always seems kind of odd, but maybe that's just a thing they do in France. I'm not really sure. But it is kind of interesting. Like even though it's a comedy, it kind of gives you a sense of what everyday life is like in France in a family. So that's pretty cool. Other shows I've watched, there's a great show called Astrid et Raphael. I think that's how it's pronounced, which there's only 8 episodes right now. It's about two police officers, both female, one of them who is on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, and kind of how she deals with that, but also how it helps her be a better police officer. Yeah, I think it's great. It's not that hard to understand in terms of vocabulary. It took me about 3 or 4 episodes to get used to their accents, but by the end of the season, I can understand it pretty well, word for word. Not everything, but I would say I would go several minutes sometimes without missing a single word. But then other minutes, I might, I would always understand, of course, the gist. But I would say as the series went on, there was a lot more sentences I understood word for word. So that's a great show. Anything else quickly? I watched this reality TV show called Les Marseillais et les Ch'tis versus Le Reste du Monde is like the full name. It's basically people from different parts of France in a reality show. So people from the south and the north versus people from Paris, basically. It's a really trashy, really bad TV show, but it's kind of fun. It's a reality show, and it's kind of nice to see people like speak French in a very natural way. It's pretty hard because there's all these different accents, but I think it's great for your ears. Yeah, and I'm not sure if there's anything else really notable. I started watching a show called Ash, which is like a situation comedy in a hospital, but it seems kind of bad. I might give it another chance later, but that's what I'm watching recently. Maybe I'll leave a link to the spreadsheet. You can take a look at what I watched. I don't necessarily recommend every single thing I've watched. Again, in terms of like your own sanity and just getting your hours up, getting towards that 1,500 hours, definitely recommend like doing a balance of different things. Maybe start with more difficult things like movies or live action TV shows, and then maybe after you've done that for an hour or two, try and do things that are easier for your brain, like animation, stuff like that, or YouTube tends to be a little bit easier depending on the channel. So that's what I've been doing just to kind of get the more amount of hours. Now this is all active, so this is all just active TV. I don't really do a lot of passive listening, like just in my ear. There aren't actually a lot of opportunities during my day where I can do that, honestly. So this is all just me watching. So I have a ways to go, about 1,000 hours left. But if I watch 2 hours a day for the next year, I should get fairly close to that 1,500 total. So stay tuned, I guess. Let's go to books now. Of course, I have a spreadsheet for everything that I've read. I kind of did this retrospectively for some of these, but now I keep track of it as I go. So in the last year, I read, I would say 27 books, I guess I would say. It's hard to say. There's kind of an overlap between when I switched my current to MIA, to Mass Immersion approach, but I would say somewhere between 27, 28 books. So right now I'm on my 35th book, I think. Yeah, I'm on my 35th book right now called La Bête Humaine by Zola, which is a book from the 19th century. And it's surprising how not that bad it is, actually. I'll talk about my Anki statistics in a minute, but on average, I would say I have to look up a word every 500 or 600 words, which is about 99 point something percent comprehension, which is really good and way higher than I would have expected. In fact, usually the difficulty are nouns for very specific things like parts of a train from the 19th century or a specific kind of dress or hat that people might wear, or like parts of a hat or like the ribbon that goes around the hat. Those like words, they're hard to visualize. The same thing with like plants and animals. They can be difficult to understand from definitions. But a lot of things like describing the scenery, for example, like I can eat that for breakfast. Like that's so easy. You can, like even books from the 19th century, like talking about the way the sun shines in the sky on the leaves and the bugs and stuff like that. Like that stuff's so easy at this point, just because I've seen it so many times in so many books. And honestly, French doesn't like it's different in the 19th century. It's definitely its own thing. But like the more I get into it, the more I realize it just kind of does the exact same thing that modern books do, but just different things. Like they just use different verbs to describe things. They kind of use different sentence structure a little bit, but all the grammar and stuff is all the same. And they use like older. There's different verb tenses, I guess they use in the 19th century, like different subjunctive tenses and stuff like that. I'm surprised how accessible it has been. So, anyways, so I read 30 at this point total from when I've started reading. I read 35 books. This is in rough order. So I read the first 3 Harry Potter books. This is a Agatha Christie translation I read. Le Petit Prince et l'Étranger. Those are books I read, and I like kind of sentence mined them pretty extensively. And then this is the point, Voyage au centre de la Terre by Jules Verne. That's when I really started doing MIA. I didn't actually sentence mine this book, but after I read this is when I would consider I started actively sentence mining. So, De la Terre à la Lune is another Jules Verne when they launch a rocket to the moon. Not a very interesting book. Le Comte de Monte Cristo, or The Count of Monte Cristo. I only read the first half, the first two volumes. I kind of got bored of it, and it was kind of getting difficult as well. I want to come back to it eventually, but the first volume actually is actually not that hard. I was really surprised. It was really accessible, even for someone who had only read less than 10 books at that point. So I'd recommend just the first volume. And it works kind of as a standalone story. So if you want to so when I don't want to spoil anything, but when someone becomes Monte Cristo, the Count of Monte Cristo, you can kind of stop. Or you can come back. You can keep on reading if you want, but I feel like it's a very satisfying, you consider ending. At that point. But La Planète des Singes, or The Planet of the Apes, it's originally a French book and it was awesome. Highly recommend it. I would say around here, book 17 is when it felt like I really started to get good at reading books, where it felt like it's sort of similar-ish to what it's like to read in English, kind of. I would say like at this point is how I feel about like 19th century books now, and that I can read it and understand everything that's going on for the more or less, but it's still like kind of hard for my brain. It feels kind of rusty at this point. It's like it takes a lot of mental effort to understand it, even though I can understand almost everything. But I don't really remember like how many words I had to look up at that point. But yeah, around this point is where I felt like kind of a turning point. Also, it was a turning point because I started reading more modern books, which is probably a good idea. Like you can definitely do a lot of older books, and I did do a lot of older books from the beginning. But honestly, it's probably just makes more sense and to read more modern books because the vocabulary and grammar will have more relevance to what you're listening to. Because I've never really watched a lot of subtitles or read a lot of subtitles. I've always just kind of watched it raw, like TV and movies. So pretty much all my vocabulary and grammar knowledge comes from books. So the closer it can be to what you're watching, like more modern books, probably the quicker progress you'll make. But again, I would say 19th century and 21st century, it's It's much more similar than you might think. It's just I think it'll be a smoother process if you kind of start with more modern books. And also, there's just a lot of great modern books. Often when we think of French literature, we think of like The Three Musketeers or Jules Verne or Les Mis or Humpback of Notre Dame. We think of those books from the 19th century, but there's tons of great books in the more modern era. So, but that's part of the fun, right? You have to explore and learn about new books. And if you keep your eye out for them, you'll find that there's way more books than you'll ever want to read or be able to read. So I actually really like Et si c'était vrai, which means like if it was true. Awesome book actually. Like it's kind of cheesy romance ghost story in a way, but I thought it was a really fun book, and like I said, it was kind of a turning point. People always recommend this book. Oops. People always recommend this book, L'Élégance du Hérisson, which is about a concierge or like a kind of a caretaker of a apartment building and like her friendship with this young girl. People always recommend it like it's an easy book. It's a really really hard book. There's a lot of really tough vocabulary and grammar because it's the whole point is la concierge. She's very intelligent secretly in her head, and so she's thinking about all these things with very high level vocabulary and grammar from all the stuff she's read. So I found it pretty difficult. It was fun. I really liked it, but not for the faint of heart. I really recommend this book, La Vérité sur l'affaire Harry Kubert. I think it's how it's pronounced. It's pretty long. It's like over 1,000 pages, but it's kind of an exciting story about this author's he's accused of murdering this girl. It's a really good page turner. I highly recommend it. Ravage. It's about the like electricity suddenly disappears on Earth. It's pretty cool. It's a really weird book, honestly, but I liked it. This one was kind of three stories, but the main one was Histoire de l'œil. Super violent, super sexual book. Very shocking, honestly. Probably one of the most shocking books I've ever read in any language, but interesting. I liked it a lot. Le Passager, it's by a French Canadian. I don't remember the author's name, but super easy actually. I recommend it for getting into books. If you want a more modern book to start getting reading after, say, Harry Potter, Le Passager. It's about a hitchhiker it's a horror book and it's about a hitchhiker. Is what I'll say. And it's very good. This is also a cool one, Les Fourmis. It's about two stories. There's one about life inside an ant colony, and then scientists or ordinary people who the stories between the ants and the people sort of go together. Sort of. It's hard to explain, but it's about ants. It's a science fiction story. It's really good. It's really weird. I mean, it's not the greatest story ever, but it's kind of a fun science fiction story if you want something different. if you have any questions or like curious about any of these books, feel free to let me know. But those are some of the notable ones. I also like L'Homme au cercle bleu. It was also quite good. If you want like a Jules Verne story, the best one to do is probably Voyage au centre de la Terre. That has like the least amount of annoying descriptive passages. I think it's an exciting story. I recommend that one. But yeah, so that's what I read, and I also have this. It's like kind of a separate list where I keep track of books I've read and also books that I want to read. And as you can see, this books I want to read keeps on getting longer and longer, which is great because you're never short of things to read. So in terms of my statistics for what I've read, currently my goal is to read 10,000 pages. So 86 and 10,000 pages is based on 300 words per page. So I kind of just figure out how many words there are per book, divide by 300 to figure out the pages. Now, I think by the time I hit 10,000 pages, I'm not going to be where I want to be when it comes to reading, but I'll be pretty comfortable with reading. Like, I'll probably be able to read most modern books without a dictionary, more or less, and that's cool. This hours is just an estimate. It's just assuming that I read it 1 minute per page, but that's probably an underestimation. But I don't really track my reading time, just the pages. So I would say the minimum is 143 hours I've done, but it's probably way more. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for reading. What I do with reading is this is where I get all my sentences for Anki. Basically, as I go, I read everything on my phone with the Kindle app. I just put my ebooks on there, and whenever there's an I+1 sentence or one target sentence, I just highlight it, and at the end, I just export everything to Google Drive and turn it into a Google Doc. And then when I time to make cards, I just read through them and make a card. I actually made a couple videos, I think, already on my channel talking about how I make cards, so I won't do that right now. But that's what I do basically. And typically in any one of these books, I'll make anywhere between 100 and 200 cards per book. So, just kind of skimming off the top. But what's funny is like when you do that, the unknown words start disappearing at a rate quicker than you might think. Because like the first few books you read, there's so many words you might not know, and you're like, if I don't learn all these, I'll never learn them. But it's funny when you only do like the very easy ones, like the low-hanging fruit, as people say. The unknown words start disappearing very quickly. I'm not really sure why that is, but it just is. I guess you learn a lot of words just incidentally. So that's reading and listening. Why don't I go into Anki and take a look at maybe some of my cards just so you can see what that's like, and then I'll look at my stats. So I haven't studied my cards yet today, so let's do one or two and just see what it's like. So I have the sentence on the front, and this one was from a book called La Gloire de mon père. It's kind of a autobiographical book about someone's father. So I don't read the sentence out loud. I can if you want. Un entonnoir assez profond et creusé dans le métal. So not a great pronunciation because I haven't really trained that yet, but basically this means that entonnoir, I think is how it's pronounced. It's kind of like a funnel inside like dug into the metal.
Entonnoir.
Entonnoir, yeah. And then on the back I have the sentence again. Again, all I'm responsible for is this word, entonnoir, and just do I understand what it means. I always read the sentence, but I don't stress if I understand everything in the sentence. All I care about is do I understand that target word. Sometimes I'll have a picture if it's easy to represent it, but you can see it's kind of like a funnel, and then I have the monolingual definition on the back. I never really like consciously did the monolingual transition. Basically, I just started reading monolingual definitions before I read the translation, and little by little, you just kind of get used to it. And even when you like can basically understand definitions in monolingually, you get better over time. Even like when you like basically can do it, there's still a pretty big gap between doing it as well as you possibly could. So if you're interested in it, I would just suggest before you ever look at the definition in English, always just read the monolingual definition, look up words if you want, and little by little, as you immerse yourself in these definitions, it'll become easier and easier. When I'm reviewing the cards, sometimes I'll read the definition, sometimes I won't. Sometimes the picture is enough for me to remember what it meant, so I won't bother reading the definition in this case. So let's do a couple more. So I'll read it out loud just for fun. Ah, vous voyez qu'il n'y avait aucune raison de vous inquiéter, répondit Macaire d'une voix guerrerette. I definitely mispronounced that. There's definitely a word that is not pronounced the way it's spelled. Guerrerette, I think it's pronounced, but I think that's wrong. It just means kind of like super happy and like, excited, basically.
Guillerette.
Guillerette, yeah. So, and then there's a definition and a picture that roughly represents it. All right, let's do it one more. Je lui ai demandé ce qui était arrivé et elle a chialé. So chialer, I believe, means to cry. It's another word for that.
Chialer.
Yeah, so pleurer means to cry. So chialer. So yeah, so that's basically it. I won't do any more. We can take a look at my stats. Right now I have 4,086 sentence cards. I definitely, one of the things I do is I delete a lot of cards. So my leech threshold is only 3, which might seem low, but I figure like if I learn a word and I can remember it for a while, then I forget it, and then I have to relearn it, and then forget it again, like 3 is plenty. Like if I'm forgetting it after 3, I'm just getting rid of it because it's not that important. And these sentences continually grow over time anyways, even when I delete cards. So I definitely am a big fan of deleting cards as we go. And yeah, usually in terms of when I make cards, I usually do them in big batches, like 50 or 60 at a time. But I found like little by little, it's been harder to find good sentences because even though I might have like 500 sentences from a book, only like a quarter of them might be any good to actually make sentences out of. So it's kind of like concerning because I'm sort of running out of like it's like I have to read so much more to find new sentences. But it's probably just the books that I'm reading. Maybe if I change what I'm reading, if I read more news maybe or different subjects, I'll probably find more good I+1 sentences. But just been doing 10 a day and only 4,086 sentences plus the about 4,000 words I learned my first year. I deleted that. I deleted it, but I made 10,000 cards, which represented about 4,000 words. So I've only technically studied 8,000 words, but I know way more than that. So again, you don't need to learn 20,000 words in Anki to have a good vocabulary, and because you learn a lot of words incidentally. But that's what I do. And in terms of the year, my statistics in terms of retention has been really good, 93%, which is really good. When it's in the young phase, it's super high, like 99%. I almost never forget it before it's mature, which is cool. I think it's just because when you mine sentences, it's such a powerful reminder, like when you can visualize the scene, that really, sometimes like it'll seem I+1 just because you just remember the scene so vividly that you understand it. But then as time goes on in like 6 months, your memory of the book decreases, so it becomes less easy to actually remember what the sentence was even about. And I have to delete those cards, but it doesn't really matter. Like definitely be very general. Like delete cards if they seem annoying. If you read a card and you're like, oh, I hate this card, definitely delete it because cards should be fun. You should be like excited to see cards and like to answer them and to know that you got them right. And yeah, so average interval is 6.1 months. Longest interval is about 2 years, 1.9 months, I guess. My average review time has always been about 15 minutes for the full year, honestly, which is great. It's not very much time at all. It takes me about 15 minutes to make 10 cards, so on average about 30 minutes a day. It's really not that much, really stress-free, honestly. Pretty easy. My review count has actually stayed very stable as well. 10 new cards a day has been very, very stable. And yeah, so that's basically that. I highly recommend not do the closed deletion fluent forever style cards. Do the kind of mass immersion approach. Sentence on the front, definition on the back. It's good enough. It takes way less time and just do more time reading. Maybe start with subtitles and then go to books as soon as you can and just do a lot of listening and you'll do fine. If I had spent, more time my first year doing reading and listening, I would be way farther ahead than from what I did, but it's all good. I'll get there eventually. Now, in terms of my ability, like I said, I kind of mentioned it with reading. I think my reading is definitely my strongest skill, just because it's so much easier to learn to read in French. But I would say probably with like a modern book, like this book, for example, L'Énigme de la Chambre 6-2. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in French, like room numbers in French, but I would say on average I would look up a word every 3 or 4 pages. So again, like 99.5 or 6% comprehension. So hypothetically, I could just never have to look up words at that level. And I would say for a lot of modern books, that's the case. But in fact, I would say my vocabulary is actually better than my reading ability because usually when I don't understand something, it's not because I don't know the words, it's that the grammar or sentence structure is just something I'm very unfamiliar with. And for some reason, it just doesn't really click. And so it's both frustrating and great because it's frustrating. There's like nothing I can do to look it up to understand the sentence. But it's great because all I have to do is just keep on reading and my reading ability will grow naturally, even if I never make another Anki card. But I'm still going to do that basically as long as I can. I'm not sure when I'll stop using Anki, but it's worked really well so far, and I'm just going to keep on doing that. But yeah, so in terms of modern novels tend to be pretty accessible at this point. I can read them pretty. I want to say comfortable, but that means different things for different people. But it's definitely not the same as English. It's still definitely significantly more work than English. But I feel like once I hit about 50 books, I would say I'll describe it as very comfortable, at least with modern books. And I'll probably get more and more into older books, 19th century books, because that's really where my interest lies. But yeah, so that's my reading. My listening, I've kind of already touched on it, but my listening is still a work in progress. Sometimes, like I said, I can go several minutes, understand everything word for word. Sometimes it's like a really blurry mess. French listening comprehension, it's really difficult. It's really hard. The way people cut words, for example, like if you want to say something like in the, like at like if you want to say right now in French, you'd say en ce moment, but no one says en ce moment. You would say en ce moment. Or if you wanted to say like on top of something, instead of saying dessus, you'd say dessus. Little things like that, and also just the way like words contract and connect together in French, plus all the mumbling on top of that. It's pretty difficult to like listening comprehension is pretty difficult in French, probably compared to other similar languages. But at the same time, again, I haven't hit 1,500 hours yet, so I can't really complain too much. But it is a little frustrating. Like you put 1 hour of reading every day, which is kind of what I did for a year, and my reading ability is ridiculously high compared to my listening. Still not where I want it to be, but it's so much higher. Whereas when I put somewhere between 2 and 3 hours a day, and it feels like I'm digging through a mountain with this spoon. It just takes so long, but I'll get there eventually. When I hit 1,500 hours, if I'm still I still can't understand a lot, maybe I'll reevaluate. But until I hit that, I have nothing really to complain about. I haven't put the time in, so if I put two something hours every day for the next year, I should get to my goal, and then I should be able to be pretty solid with listening comprehension. And if I keep on reading, my vocabulary is going to be. I mean, my vocabulary has never been the thing that's held back my listening. It's literally just processing the phonemes, and phonemes in French are quite different. So and like the way everything blurs together can be quite challenging to hear, and the speed as well. So my vocabulary and grammar has never been what's held me back. It's just processing the information in real time. But again, it is getting better little by little. I have to put in the time. That's all it is to it. And yeah, and then in terms of my speaking, like I did a italki session a couple days ago just to kind of see where I was at, what it was like, and it was cool. It was fun. Like I talked the whole time with the tutor, but it was nothing like fluent speech. Like I could communicate fine. She understood me. No issues with my pronunciation. I mean, my pronunciation is not very good because I haven't trained it yet, but it was okay. And she never misunderstood me or misunderstood a word I said, and I understood her 100% perfectly. There was like one word I think she said I couldn't quite hear what she said, but. And it was kind of cool when you like say you're like thinking of an idea of what you want to say, kind of in mental ease, as Matt talks about, and you're like, oh, I heard something that someone said once, and this is the exact perfect idiomatic phrase to say in this situation. You say it, and they understood, and you're like, yes, like that's exactly right. But I would say most of the time, like, yeah, it's still kind of rough. But that I haven't built up like the mental muscle memory to like just say words naturally, just because I haven't put in the time. But like, I'm not going to spend that much time talking until my listening comprehension is better. Maybe when I hit 1,000 hours, maybe that's when I'll start. But right now, I feel like my listening comprehension is holding me back so much that there's no real point in doing a lot of speaking practice, in my opinion. Feel free to disagree. And I've done a little tiny bit of writing. Sometimes I'll do like a YouTube comment or a tweet or a Reddit comment in French, but not a lot. But I mean, I try and just make sure it's correct and stuff. And yeah, last thing I guess I'll say is grammar. Little by little, like French grammar feels like it's sort of shrinking, right? Like when you get used to it, it's like there's not actually that many topics in French grammar, even in like older books. Like really, like it's like you run out of things to think about. It's all these little details though that I still haven't quite completely mastered, especially with formal writing because I haven't done a lot, and it just takes a while to get used to. Like this, like there. But I would say though that verbs are not as hard as I would have expected. Like I've never really memorized a verb chart, but little by little, like when I was talking, for example, it was not hard to think of the conjugations of verbs. That was not what was holding me back. It was more just not knowing exactly idiomatically how to say things or how to come out fluidly and stuff like that. Sometimes I would just randomly forget a word that I knew pretty well. Now, if I did more like formal writing, perhaps that'd be more of an issue. But when you do formal writing, you can always just look up the conjugations anyways, unless it's a test. So, but there's definitely a lot of grammar that I haven't completely internalized yet. Subjunctive is getting better, I would say. For example, it's not too bad in French, honestly. And like little connecting words can be kind of tricky, like laquelle or lequel in French or don. Those words I definitely have not. It's not like I understand them easily when I read them, but I can't reproduce them quite yet, at least in a natural way. So there's like all these little details in grammar that I haven't quite mastered yet. But read 20 or 30 more books. I'm sure I'll be a lot better. Once in a while I'll look up grammar concepts in a book, but as of now, again, just reading and then once in a while checking references seems to be perfectly fine. And in fact, it's funny, like the hardest things to read and for me in French are stuff written by like students of French. Like when they're like, like, oh, I'm doing my practice, my writing, and then they write a tweet or a Reddit post, and I'm not trying to make fun of people or anything, but those are like the hardest things to read because you read them and this is like very unnatural French. It's very unlike most of the stuff I read. So you're like, it's like it takes your brain a while to actually understand what they're saying, even though they're speaking relative or they're writing relatively simply. So that's why I'm really taking my time with before I start outputting. When I have read 50 books and 1,500 hours of listening, maybe I'll get more and more into it. But basic MIA philosophy is get your comprehension to close to 100% and then start doing your output. And that's more or less the plan. Like I have no super strong desire to talk to people in French, honestly, at this point. When I get better, of course I do, but really like reading and listening is what I like the most anyways. So I'm fine with waiting. It's not like I'm moving to France or Quebec next week, so I have all the time in the world. But in a year, if I do everything right, I think I should be at a pretty good level where I can start talking and writing a bit more. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really have much more to say. That's been my experience. One thing I will say is that French is definitely taking longer than I would have expected. Like if you add it up, 560 plus, I guess maybe minimum 700 for reading plus Anki is about 150 hours. So I've done about 850 hours this year of French. So that's somewhere between about 2.5 hours a day on average, to somewhere between 2.5 and 3, which is not bad. And then that's on top of what I did my first year. I did 300 hours of Anki plus about 100 to 200 hours. So I've put in well over 1,000 hours into French the last couple of years, but it's definitely taking longer than I would have expected, especially because people sometimes seem to talk like French is like such an easy language, and it is to some extent compared to like Asian languages, but it's not like a walk in the park either. It does definitely takes time. Like you're expect to take at least 2,000 hours sink into it before you're like really proficient. Like if you're looking like if you just want to like travel, like I definitely like if I dropped into France and where in a village where no one spoke English, I would be fine. Like I could communicate. I would not starve to death. It would be fine. Like I have no issues with that. It's more just actually being proficient and actually talking somewhat like a native speaker, at least close to it. That's where I'm still far ways away. And I think with like French actually and similar languages to English, you can kind of fall into a trap where you think you're way better than you actually are, especially if you start talking early, because when you can start talking early, it's like you can actually have pretty cool conversations. You talk for an hour with someone, you're like, oh my gosh, like I just have to do like a little bit more study and I'm basically fluent. But it's actually kind of an illusion because you can kind of rely a little bit on your English knowledge and cognates and stuff when you're actually really far away. Like could you actually go on a reality TV show and not get annihilated by the language? Like not even close. Like the way people talk naturally as native speakers, like super fast, a mile a minute, slur their words, like talk angrily amongst each other. Like could you survive in that environment? Like I couldn't, and so I'm still a ways away from that. So that's why like I would suggest people to assume that you're worse than you are when it comes to like a romance language, because you can heavily rely on your ability in English to kind of as a crutch, but you're probably much farther away from your actual goal than you might think. So I would just be careful. Like don't get stuck in the Dunning-Kruger curve, because that's a real problem I think with languages similar to English. So again, not to like make fun of anyone, and I'm fairly self-deprecating, so I try not to like chump myself up anyway, but I guess that's all I have to say about that. I don't think I have any other comments, I guess. One thing I was thinking about is should I have done more subtitle reading when I was earlier in the process? Probably, but so far the strategy of only reading and listening has worked pretty well. Like reading books and watching TV without subtitles, it's worked pretty well. Like definitely learn a lot of slang and stuff just from listening, and the little phrases people say like every time, like "qu'est-ce qu'il y a" as an example, like "what's going on" or "qu'est-ce qui se passe." Like these things, like things that are said all so often. Like I never made an Anki card. You just kind of pick them up and learn them. So it definitely works. I don't know if that's the most efficient way, but I will say that like there's tons of stuff that I'm listening to that I know that I wouldn't have understood if I hadn't read so much, because the words it's those annoying 1 to 2% words of the language that are just random and rare, that by reading so much, I feel like I've learned so many of them. I still have a long way to go, I think, but I think that's definitely been an advantage, because if you're learning those like very rare words just from subtitles, you might not never hear that word again for like 500 hours. So you'll never learn it in that context. So by reading though, more rare words come up more frequently, rare grammar structures as well. So I think overall, I think my strategy has been fine, other than not re-listening enough. But again, like I said, if I just listen 2 to 3 hours every day actively, I should get where I want to be by the end of the year. So, anyways, if you have any questions, please let me know. I know not a lot of people talk about MIA in terms of French and Romance languages. People kind of downplay it sometimes, like you can do it in a month, but you really can. Like if you devote like 10 hours a day, perhaps you could probably get to a decent level in 6 months, I guess. But that's a lot of time. But anyways, I should probably stop. So, anyways, hopefully this is helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions or you're curious, or if you want to talk, if you're studying French with MIA, if you want to like chat about it, feel free to let me know. And anyways, so yeah.